Yes. Good. I have already commented on this many times today, and I will repeat it again. Decisions, whoever made them, on the supply of tanks to Kiev indicate that the collective West is deliberately escalating the conflict, raising the stakes, and it is obvious that neither Kiev nor the West is in the mood for any diplomatic settlement. This is the blocking at the legislative level of negotiations with our country. This in reprisals within the country with the negotiators. These are demands, not requests, but demands to supply more and more weapons. These are statements by Western diplomats that now is the time for decisions on the battlefield, and not for diplomacy, and so on. They do not hide it. We emphasize it. That their main task is to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. To achieve this goal, the US and its allies continue to pump weapons into the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. For this they are ready to sacrifice the whole of Ukraine, all its inhabitants. No one in Washington and Brussels takes into account the interests of these people. Zelensky doesn't care about people at all. He doesn't care about that at all. Do you understand? Some people ask why you think that? Allegedly, he does all this for the sake of people. I will answer you. When he came into politics, I mean he was never in politics. When he decided to run for president, he told everyone, not once, but every day, that he would be the president of the world. That the only thing he was going for was peace. He knelt down and swore. I don't know what gods he swore. It's hard to say. From his actions, at first I thought he was an unbeliever. Now it seems to me that he is a believer. Only he believes in some kind of forces of evil and darkness. That was it. They were filming a feature film. They came up with an image for him. The way of thinking was imposed on people, suggesting that he would be a person from the people, who would carry the will of the people, would implement it, and so on. The main thing in this was to create an effect. Then no one paid attention. But it was necessary. With what money is all this done? Who is behind this? What are these technologies? He cheated. He deceived in such a way, it seems to me, that no one has deceived in recent history. If he deceived then, can anyone trust him now? To believe that he needs all these tanks, all this money, all these material military capabilities for the future of Ukraine. He lies just as he lied when he was on his knees before the Ukrainian people. Just like he lied when he was directly asked if he had any drug addiction. He lied then. He lies now. You will ask why? For one reason. He has nothing to do with the Ukrainian people. He never thought about those people whose lives are now in his hands. They are not even pawns to him. When people play chess, every pawn is valuable. It can become a queen, including because it is your game and because it is your resource. For him, people are not even pawns. They are nothing. Only money matters to him. Only political bravura speeches and applause matter. Only personal ambitions. Only that. Everything else is not just secondary. Everything else does not exist in this painful logic of an aggressive, bloody little man. As you understand. For its part, Our country has always remained open to the possibility of using diplomatic and negotiation tools. We have talked about this many times. All this was applied by us, and all this was blocked by the Kiev regime under the dictation of the West. Therefore, the collective West, NATO, the EU have long abandoned diplomacy. They have long chosen a different path and began to create security threats, inflaming and simply pushing the European continent to a global catastrophe. I want to say that what is happening now is not a matter of Ukraine, Russia, or even the European continent. This is a much larger and global thing. You know, I want to tell you the following. You asked about the U.S. decision to supply American tanks. Why supply them? It seems to me that everything is clear here, that such a position applies to tanks produced in all countries. Only one country stands out. I think it's Germany. This is a special story. We remember very well what German tanks are. These are machines that have become a symbol of not just death, not just a deadly ideology. They have become a symbol of misanthropy, a global, existential threat to the entire planet. When you read about fascism, about Nazism, about the times of the Second World War, then I think that the SS uniform and these German tanks were the symbols of the Third Reich, have become a global symbol of humanity's fall into the abyss of hatred, horror and murder. From this abyss, and those who were then, and those who were born later, all of us were saved by the soldiers of the Red Army and the anti-Hitler coalition. These were young guys who fought at the front and all those who joined them in the rear then. It was the German tanks that became the anti-symbol. That was forever imprinted in the memory of mankind. Now these German tanks will again go across our land. This is how they assume they will go. At least that's what they were given. What is expected in Berlin? That armored vehicles in camouflage colors with iron crosses, with symbols of the German armed forces, both then and now, will pass through our cities and villages? We remember how it ended then. Do they remember this in Berlin? Most importantly, they must understand that the Germans have no moral right to supply their armored vehicles for military operations against Russia. I would like to draw your attention to the words that were spoken on January 25th in the German parliament in the Bundestag. The deputy of the German Bundestag said, referring to Scholz, he said that this was a historic day and that Scholz had just destroyed all foundations of German foreign policy in the post-war period. Germany bears a special responsibility for the victims of the Second World War. This has long been the core of Germany's existence. He meant that 6 million Jews, but also more than 20 million men, women and children, died on the territory of the Soviet Union. Also, within the walls of the Bundestag, he recalled that the great predecessors of the current rulers of the mines of Germany, namely Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt. This is an assessment given by the Germans themselves, and not by me. They did a lot in the name of peace and reconciliation. As the German deputy noted, Willy Brandt even received the Nobel Peace Prize for this. The slogan never again meant refusing to supply weapons to the conflict zones. This has always been the core of German foreign policy, said the German deputy. Everyone entered their names in history in different ways. In Germany itself, they are well aware that Berlin has no moral, legal, or ethical right to supply armored vehicles and tanks so that they kill Russians. You know, the Russians say, are there very few video footage that even in the ranks of Ukraine, the guys zombified by the Kiev regime, and many of them were pushed to the front line because they were caught all over Ukraine by these Nazis, who themselves do not crawl out of bunkers. These the guys also speak Russian. Don't you understand that people, even members of the same family, they pushed, pitted, they made them, as it is now called, opposing sides. A crack has passed through the mother's heart because one of her sons is on one side of the barricades and the second son is on the other. Because everything has been done for many years in order to tear Ukraine apart, given its very difficult history, multinational composition in the first years of the independence, that many dreamed of there. But it should begin not with permissiveness, but with responsibility. Now these bloody dividing lines have passed through the hearts of a huge number of people. These regions will again feel the tracks of German tanks. Still, Scholz went for it. Why? Let's be honest. Because there are historical figures. And there are dummies. That's all. There are people who are ready for their convictions to go even to certain death. Not because it is pride, and not because they consider themselves exceptional, but because they understand that this is humanity. There are those who have political power, material resources, support, including electoral support, but they lack the spirit to make the right choice, not to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors, for which, including the people of Germany, they paid a huge price. I want to remind Scholz, I'm not talking about Burbach. It seems to me that it's useless, but he still hesitated. I want to remind, and maybe tell. He probably doesn't know. When the German prisoners were on the territory of the Soviet Union after our victory, they were not tortured. They were not mocked in the same way as they were mocked at our soldiers and civilians in German concentration camps. They were fed by those who for many years not only lacked but had nothing to eat. I say this softly. In everyday life, I would say differently. They fed them. You know, Mr. Scholz, my grandmother, who all her life looked at bread as the most amazing dish. She told me about it. This post-war bread, which was also lacking. The Soviet people, and in particular she, a Russian, shared with German prisoners who burned our villages, who killed children, driving them into houses and setting them on fire. I asked her once, "Grandmother, but you yourself did not have enough. How could you, having gone through all this, still share bread with those who killed you?" Do you know, Mr. Scholz, what my grandmother told me? She told me, "Masha, we felt sorry for them." This is not the pity you call tolerance. They felt sorry for them, which means they loved them, which means they had the spiritual strength to share even with the enemy the most necessary things. You in the West have long lost any idea of the true values, which are based on love. It is impossible to believe that the West is now supplying German tanks to places where these tanks have already brought so much trouble and suffering, having killed tens of millions of people. It is impossible to imagine that you know what love, compassion, honor, conscience, after all. By the way, I remember very well how, a couple of years ago, German Foreign Minister Steinmeier arrived in Volgograd as part of an official delegation. He repented and bowed his head before the graves of both our soldiers and the German soldiers who remained on our land. And he said it should never happen again. You are repeating it now. The day the decision was made on the supply of Leopard tanks to Ukraine, as the German deputy said, is a historic day also because it finally testified, cemented what we have been talking about for a long time. This is Germany's absolute loss of its sovereignty. Scholz signed forever in the rejection of an independent German foreign policy. He abandoned everything that his predecessors built decades after the Second World War. And in this, by the way, they succeeded. I must say that now we will not be surprised if the places of German Leopard tanks in the Bundeswehr are taken not by new German-made vehicles, but by American Abrams tanks. After all, it is very beneficial to Washington. Berlin now you cannot ask. It was and it ended. Yes. Merkel tried as much as she could to defend and balance between her own national interests and between this wild pressure that the American administration exerted on her and on the people of Germany. In general, Americans always treat an occupied country this way. And now that's all. Washington's goals were announced last year at congressional hearings. Do you remember what U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland said? It is necessary to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia.